Hello everyone, this video is about scope of practice and scope of competence. So what is scope of practice? Scope of practice is a legal concept that defines what we as MFTs are allowed to do. Just like there's a scope of practice for MFTs, there's also a scope of practice for other professions like psychiatrists or psychologists and so on. So by saying it's a legal concept, it essentially means that the law is what defines our scope of practice. So these are the procedures, actions, and processes that are permitted for an individual in a given role, in our case, as MFTs. So to sum up what that means in a simple sentence, the scope of practice is what the law permits you as an MFT to do. So what is that for MFTs? The law basically defines our scope of practice as MFTs as providing therapy that is focused on social and relational issues. The emphasis is on the relational context. Okay? In order to do this, we are permitted within our scope of practice to provide therapy for individuals, groups, children, and families. One question that always tends to come up when going over scope of practice is how are we permitted to work with individuals when our scope of practice defines our work as relational? Okay? The answer is that at the root of most mental health problems that we address in therapy is some kind of relational issue. For example, if you have someone who's depressed, it's likely that something happened in their relationship, such as a hurt, a loss, or something of the sort that has contributed to the depression. And when the person is depressed, they tend to isolate, which is then impacting their social relationships moving forward. And so that would be a relational way of looking at depression. So even if we're working with an individual, the root of their problems and the subsequent consequences tend to be relational in nature. Okay? So when we work with that individual, we can help them to make their relational contexts more fulfilling and to address their mental health issues by considering the relationships they have around them or don't. Okay? Something to keep in mind is what is outside of our scope of practice. So some things that are related to mental health, but are definitely outside of our scope of practice as MFTs would be things related to medication. So prescribing, giving advice about medication, making recommendations about medication, those things are outside of our scope of practice according to the law and would be inside of the scope of practice for a psychiatrist or a primary care provider perhaps. Similarly, psychological testing, unless you've been specifically trained for psychological testing, that tends to be outside of the scope of practice for MFTs, and it is inside the scope of practice for clinical psychologists. Now, there's a benefit to having the scope of practice really clearly laid out by the law when you consider team-based approaches. So defining scopes for various professions can be helpful in mental health because each professional can be responsible for a component of the client's treatment, and then everyone can ideally work together to provide a holistic and integrated approach to addressing their mental health issues. So let's consider, for example, that you have a client named Leticia, and she's depressed. If all of these folks here in this image are part of her team, each would address the whys of her depression as well as her treatment a little bit differently, okay? So let's work through these. The psychologist could examine Leticia's inner experience and uncover the root of her depression, perhaps exploring childhood wounds, early caregiver relationship, things in her unconscious, and so on. And also perhaps complete psychological testing to explore personality factors that might contribute to Leticia's depression. A social worker could connect Leticia to external social support services in like a case management type of style. For example, if Leticia's depression is caused by unemployment, or that's one of the factors contributing to it, then the social worker could help link Leticia to resources that could help her with this and could address that unemployment issue. The primary care provider could assess for any physical causes or contributors to her depression. You know, for example, if she has some kind of chronic illness, that might be contributing to her depression and is important to note. A psychiatrist could complete a psychiatric assessment and determine if perhaps medication would be helpful in treating Leticia's depression. And then finally, as an MFT, you could examine Leticia's behavior in its social and relational context and consider whether relationships are part of a source of her depression, And at the same time, work with her to develop solutions through social skills building, social support groups, and things to reduce isolation that tends to be really common in depression. And in this way, everybody contributes a little bit something different in the hopes of providing holistic treatment. Okay. So that scope of practice, remember, scope of practice is a legal concept. It's defined by the law, and it describes what we are allowed to do as MFTs. Okay. Now we're going to switch gears to scope of competence. Sounds similar, but different. So scope of competence is an ethical issue, whereas scope of practice was legal. Scope of competence is an ethical issue, meaning there's no law defining it. And your scope of practice essentially defines the area of practice within the field that you as an individual are proficient to work in. This is your area, your skill set, your knowledge. It is specific to every individual MFT. My scope of competence as an MFT is different from yours as an MFT trainee, or from my colleague who's also an MFT, right? Because it's based on what I have learned, what my expertise is in, and so on. So unlike scope of practice, which is the same across the board for all MFTs, scope of competence is defined by the individual therapist based on your own skill set. As a graduate student, your scope of competence is quite limited because you only have a foundational knowledge for the treatment of basic mental health issues. But through practicum and the supervision you receive there, your scope of competence will expand. You'll have more familiarity with treating different issues, okay? And it'll continue to expand during your supervised clinical experience and the gaining of your 3,000 hours and beyond, especially if you expose yourself to diverse clients and seek out different trainings. Okay, so you can expand your scope of competence by seeking supervision, training, education, diverse clientele, and so on. Whereas scope of practice is, it is what it is always, scope of competence can be expanded by you, the individual MFT. How do we handle issues of scope? So during your practice, you need to make objective and honest assessments of how far you can safely go with your clients. Knowing where your competence lies, how much work can you do with this particular client? Can you work with this particular client? Do you have the knowledge necessary to provide competent treatment to them? If it becomes clear to you in this process that the client's needs exceed your scope of competence, you must either develop the competence necessary through things like training and education and supervision to effectively treat that client, or you must refer the client out to a competent professional. One really good example is working with eating disorders. Eating disorders tend to be a very specialized treatment approach. They require a very specialized treatment approach. And unless you've been explicitly trained in that and received supervised clinical experience with that, it will likely be outside of your scope of competence, right? And in that case, it may be more beneficial to the client to refer them out if you cannot provide the service that they need. If you do decide to work with the client in order to expand your scope, you should seek consultation before you practice. So, for example, if you encounter a client who's experiencing domestic violence and you don't have a lot of experience in that, but your supervisor does, they can work with you and consult with you and train you and supervise your work so that you can build your competence in that area. Okay? When you don't have access to this type of professional to help you, it's imperative that you make a skillful referral so that you don't potentially do harm or, at the minimum, waste your client's time by not knowing how to treat them appropriately. Some important takeaways. Scope of practice is defined by the law for all MFTs. Can't be changed, can't be expanded unless you seek out another license, like you become a clinical psychologist in addition to an MFT. This is why some therapists do that, right? So they can do things like neuropsychology. Scope of competence, on the other hand, is a personal description of what you as the therapist are equipped to treat. Ethically, you shouldn't work outside your scope because it could cause harm to the client. But if you're in training, under supervision, and intentionally expanding your scope of competence, that's a little different, or a lot of different. If you get a case that's clearly outside your scope of competence, you should refer the person out. Let's look at a sample question, an example here. So, a therapist has opened her own private practice after spending many years as an event planner for weddings and parties. One of her newer clients expressed concerns that upcoming wedding planning is costing her fiance and the client a lot of money, and they are looking for the best locations and vendors to use for the wedding. The therapist knows many people in that town that offer low pricing. The therapist legally should. Okay, so let's look at the answer choices. A, give a list of vendors the client should use so her anxiety levels can go down. B, contact her friend who's a florist and give her the client's info for her to contact with a flower quote. C, do not mention the fact that she was a wedding planner and give assistance because it's outside of the scope of practice. D, do not help the client since it's outside of the scope of competence. Give you a second to think about it. Okay, so let's work through these. A, give a list of vendors. So this is problematic because it's going outside of the therapist's scope of practice. In this context, the therapist is a therapist and should do what is within the therapist's scope of practice. Even though she knows about wedding planning, that is not inside the scope of practice of an MFT. It doesn't say in the law that you provide wedding planning during therapy, okay? So this is not an okay answer. It goes outside of her scope of practice. B, contacting her friend who's a florist. This has the same problems as A. It's going outside of her scope of practice because she's not in her wedding planning capacity. And to make this even worse, even more problematic, it breaks the client's confidentiality. Now the florist, who's your friend, who knows you're a therapist, has information for someone who she can assume is your client, and that breaks confidentiality. C, this is the correct answer. This answer here shows the therapist staying in her lane of scope of practice, not mentioning her competence in another area, and staying focused on her job as an MFT. D is problematic because it's talking about scope of competence. There's a couple issues with that. One, the question says the therapist legally should, and scope of competence is not a legal issue, it's an ethical issue. So that should already cross that one out. Secondly, this isn't technically correct. As a prior wedding planner, event planner, this therapist does have competence in the area of wedding planning, right? So it's not a scope of competence issue. The problem here is scope of practice, and that she shouldn't cross her wedding planning with her therapy role. All right. Oops. So the final piece of this lecture is referrals, and referrals are useful to discuss when going over scope because referrals are a useful way of addressing issues with scope of competence and scope of practice. So when do you provide referrals? Anytime a client has issues that are outside of your scope of practice and you don't have that are outside of your scope of practice, you need to refer them out. So for example, if a client is experiencing some kind of biological symptoms or has a condition that we know would benefit from medication like bipolar disorder, we want to refer them to a psychiatrist. Now, in the case of the bipolar disorder, you could continue to see them and provide the relational therapy piece, but you want to make sure that they get the other needs met as well. If their needs are outside of your scope of competence, right, and you don't have someone to train you and supervise you and consult with, then you should refer them out so that they can get the treatment that they need. And I provided some examples of situations where this might happen. So I mentioned eating disorders already. Severe substance use is probably going to be outside of your scope of competence early on unless you get advanced training. And autism treatment tends to be outside of our scope as MFTs unless you get the training for it, which you don't tend to get in a graduate program. When else to provide referrals? If the client can't afford your fee, and we'll do fees later in the semester, but just to introduce it to you, if someone can't afford your fee, you want to make sure to provide them with low cost or no cost referrals so that they can still get services. If you're if you're full, you're not taking any clients, providing them with a referral is helpful. When you're terminating a client prematurely, so you're moving, you're stopping your practice, whatever reason, you want to provide them referrals so that you don't abandon the client. And if the client is not making progress in therapy, you've tried different things, you've made adjustments, you've discussed it with them, and they're still not progressing, it's just not a good fit, then it would be appropriate to provide a referral in this case. Do remember to always document in your notes when you give referrals as a way of protecting you and having a complete treatment record. And then finally, accepting referrals. Just a reminder that you cannot accept payments for accepting or giving referrals. It is not okay. This creates a conflict of interest and is both unethical and illegal, meaning it's against the law. Okay, so we do not accept payment for accepting or giving referrals. And that's it for this topic. So let me know if you have questions. Thank you.